Should the New Orleans Saints just make Deshaun Watson's decision for him? Everything you need to know in terms of the updates around this weird Watson situation, what the New Orleans Saints could do if he chooses Atlanta, and is Malcolm Jenkins on his way to retirement? We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. And don't forget that we are free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube as well. And of course, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter. You can find me over at USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And in my opinion, the New Orleans Saints may want to consider here making Deshaun Watson's decision for him and removing themselves from this situation. Let's talk about why. I just think it's an option for them, because when you look at where all of this has gone, and you look right now, the New Orleans Saints and the Atlanta Falcons, the two finalists when it comes to the final decision for Deshaun Watson to choose whether or not he's, which team he's going to play for and all of that. Now, he's from the Atlanta area, Gainesville. He has, some good things to look forward to in New Orleans in terms of a defense, all the other things. There's still so many question marks about, is he going to be suspended for the sexual misconduct cases that are out there, right? Court of the law, different than the court of the NFL. All of that. So regardless of what happens with the currently still open 22 civil cases, you still run the risk of not having him for a good portion of the season. So there's all these things that these teams have already done sort of like their own gymnastics for in terms of figuring out why this is a good idea in the first place, right? And they all feel that a guy like Deshaun Watson can bring them wins whenever he's going to be available to the team. So how much do you care about 6 to 12 games versus, 8 to 10 years, right? So you might be willing to deal with that, go into 2023 and then look at it there. That's reportedly been the Atlanta Falcons pitch, like, hey, we're not going to be very good in 2022, but come 2023, you just wait. And so I think that when you look at all this and you see now the Atlanta Falcons reaching a deal with Matt Ryan to push a $7.5 million roster bonus back to Tuesday, 4 days later than what it was supposed to trigger, which effectively means that for Atlanta, they're hoping that within the next few days that they're going to see Deshaun Watson potentially choose Atlanta, in which case they would then trade Matt Ryan. And whether he goes to Indianapolis or whether he's part of the trade remains to be seen. But that seems to be what it is that signals. But then you see at the same time Deshaun Watson saying, hey, I'm going to take the weekend here and really mull this over, as if he hasn't had over a year to think about this already when he's been demanding being traded away from Houston for more than a calendar year at this point. And by the way, the team that has been strung along the most throughout that entire situation was Carolina, and they're no longer in the running anymore. They just got cast off in the midst of all this. So the Browns and the Panthers are officially out, and it's just the Saints and the Falcons. So what are you waiting for? Like, what's the situation here? And I understand, it's not a hard decision, right? I mean, it's a big decision, but honestly, you're in a situation here to where you have two teams that have almost embarrassed themselves at this point in terms of especially when you look at the way that several teams that have embarrassed themselves, right? Look at what happened with the Browns. Look at what happened with Atlanta moving back this roster bonus for Matt Ryan. Like, these are hoops that these teams are jumping through, and relationships that these teams are hurting, right? Like Cleveland's not going to have a quarterback next year, possibly, because Baker Mayfield wants out in the midst of all this. That might be the same thing for Atlanta and Matt Ryan, by the way. That might be the reason that they pushed that roster bonus back. So when you look at where all of this, or how all of this has sort of come to a head at this point, and then for Deshaun Watson to just say, I'm going to take the weekend while the rest of free agency stalls, right? While wide receivers and these players that teams like the New Orleans Saints need begin signing contracts elsewhere. Allen Robinson now off the market. He's in Los Angeles. Now Los Angeles is looking to potentially ship away Robert Woods, but can you get involved in trade talks there? No, because you have all of your trade assets funneled into this potential move that might not even go your way at this point. And honestly, even though yesterday morning it looked like things were leaning Saints, now everything's sort of taking a Falcons lean. So at what point do you just say, you know what? As a quarterback, I expect you to be decisive. And if you're going to sit here and do this, we're good. And then they move on. Because there are a lot of other options out there. And reportedly, Jameis Winston has already gotten an offer earlier this offseason from the New Orleans Saints that is still on the table. And at this point, I think whatever that offer is, you're probably going to have to come in higher than that offer now, right? Because you've strung Jameis Winston along, you've been strung along while you're being strung along by Deshaun Watson, waiting for him to make this decision. What's going to happen with Terron Armstead, who's reportedly waiting to see how the quarterback situation pans out, if he's going to stay in New Orleans, if he's going to go elsewhere. How much longer are you really willing to risk the rest of the building blocks that you could potentially be bringing in with $30 million of cap space for the first time in like years for this guy? For an indecisive person that won't make a decision even though he's in the spotlight of the entire sports world right now? Is that really what you want? I don't know. Maybe it is. And maybe it all, things happen and then you forget all of this later on down the road. But you have to remember that this is a guy that could serve another suspension, that could serve future that could deal with future allegations, that could deal with any of these other 22 civil suits being elevated to criminal cases. Like, there's so many variables to all of this that you just kind of have to wonder at what point, where's the risk versus the reward? If you're going to be strung along like this and then potentially miss out on these other quarterbacks, these other wide receivers, these other pieces that you need around this team to potentially make more holes on your team and give up draft capital, like leave the quarterback out of the situation. It doesn't make any sense, right? So it's an interesting one, obviously, to continue to watch, and we'll see exactly how this all pans out. But at a certain point, you kind of wonder, right? Like, does this really signal a desire to be in New Orleans and to play for New Orleans? Or is this indecisiveness something that makes you kind of hit pause on this and say, is this really what we want as an NFL franchise in the eyes of the New Orleans Saints? I don't know. The other piece to all this too is that, look, players, teams, they might be perfectly content waiting. Everybody might be perfectly content waiting. It certainly looks that way, as there's been nothing happening in the market while all this is on hold, except for the Allen Robinson signing, Larry Ogunjobi failing a physical, and Devontae Adams being traded to the Raiders, which the New Orleans Saints were never going to be in that conversation in the first place. Devontae Adams wanted to play with Derek Carr. So at this point, how much is really happening, or how much is happening behind the scenes, right? Are the New Orleans Saints still, like, you see Atlanta still having visits, right? Jarvis Landry visiting, Traquan Smith visiting, all of that. Are the New Orleans Saints negotiating terms that they're willing to agree to with free agents based upon, hey, when all of this wraps up and we restructure that contract and we're ready to spend the money? Maybe that's what's going on. But as of right now, this just kind of looks embarrassing for Deshaun Watson and everybody involved as they all play this waiting game. So the next thing I want to talk about is, what do the New Orleans Saints do if Deshaun Watson ultimately chooses Atlanta? Who's the quarterback? Who do they pursue? What other free agents are out there? There's a long list. So let's talk about how to build this team without Deshaun Watson in preparation for him potentially ending up in Atlanta as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. First, I want to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net. BetOnline, of course, our exclusive online betting partners. They've got odds in terms of where Deshaun Watson will land. And right now, the New Orleans Saints are still the favorite. 10-13. You can also see minus 200 there. So there's still the odds-on favorite to land Deshaun Watson with the Falcons, either at a 1-for-1 or a plus 150 is what it looks like. So if you want to get in on those odds, as well as a bunch of other stuff around Devontae Adams and his new landing place, how he's going to perform there, where Baker Mayfield's going to be week 1, if not with the Browns. By the way, the Colts are the odds-on favorite for that one. These are things you want to get in on. Go and check them out over at betonline.net. By the way, the Saints right now, in terms of odds when it comes to Baker Mayfield, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th right now, tied with the Panthers, 8-1. So yeah, we'll see how that all goes. Anyway, you can go check it out. Bet Online, they got everything. If you don't want to bet on football, don't worry. We've also got baseball in terms of free agency, everything on the way there. College basketball with March Madness, the tournament underway. Already some big upsets that we've seen. Kentucky, what's going on? So go and check them out over at betonline.net, where the game starts. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks as always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out that Locked On NFL YouTube channel and Locked On NFL podcast. All the national stories that you need from the local angles and the local experts in less than 30 minutes. So I want to talk about now the New Orleans Saints and what they could be doing with $30 million of cap space instead of sitting around and waiting for Deshaun Watson. Now, I understand that teams may believe that Deshaun Watson gives them the better chance to win, but what happens if Deshaun Watson simply doesn't choose New Orleans and he chooses to go back close to home to Atlanta? What are some of the moves that they could potentially make? Well, they already have an offer on the table, as we mentioned before, for Jameis Winston earlier on in the offseason. I imagine that contract was probably akin to, or that offer was probably akin to what they offered him last year, right? Incentive driven, 1 year, maybe 2 years, but not anything astronomical, not what you would usually expect to see for a starting quarterback. Now, with this situation having gone on with Deshaun Watson, I'm curious. I don't think that Jameis Winston is in a situation where he wouldn't go back to New Orleans, but would New Orleans have to go back to that offer and then bring it up a little bit, right? Pay him a little bit more, especially when you're sitting there with $30 million of free salary cap space, and New Orleans Saints usually don't have that. And so they're usually kind of having to do these these backloaded contracts, cheaper the first year, get a little bit more expensive the second and third years, sort of elevating in terms of base salary. Now they got this big old chunk of change, and it kind of makes you wonder if a quarterback like Jameis Winston or any other free agent, honestly, is looking at that going, you got to come up a little bit more. So it'd be really interesting to see if that ends up being the case, right? If Deshaun Watson goes to Atlanta, I still think Jameis Winston can end up in New Orleans, and I still think that's probably the most likely situation as Deshaun Watson gets less likely or starts to feel less likely. You can agree with me on that if you feel that way. If you don't, then that's fine. But it just feels a little bit less likely that it's going to be Deshaun Watson. And so as that happens, the other side is that it gets to feeling a little bit more likely when it comes to Jameis Winston. So you sign Jameis Winston, I would think, and I think that's going to take probably about half of that $30 million. Then you get to start doing the situation of, hey, little bit of salary cap space, but look what we've got here. I think you got to try to bring Terron Armstead back. There's a good relationship there, by the way, between Terron Armstead and Jameis Winston. Terron Armstead has reportedly been waiting to see what happens with the Deshaun Watson situation. And I think a lot of people have seen that as if Deshaun Watson goes to New Orleans, then that's where Terron Armstead will want to stay. But there's still a chance that Terron Armstead sticks around with Jameis because he and Jameis have a really good relationship. They work together. They've talked to like they have a lot of the same people in common. Like they have that overlap. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Terron Armstead stick around, even if it's Jameis under center as opposed to Deshaun Watson. It gets even more unlikely if Jameis ends up signing elsewhere, which is just part of why this whole waiting game feels a little bit self-destructive in a way, or potentially self-destructive in a way. But there's a good relationship there. So maybe Terron Armstead comes back. Maybe he doesn't. We'd have to see how that all pans out. But obviously that would be a huge benefit for New Orleans to maintain Terron Armstead and not have that spot to fill. If Terron Armstead doesn't stick around, if you lose out on Deshaun Watson, then you have that whole rotation that we've talked about, moving Ryan Ramczyk to left tackle, plugging James Hurst in at right tackle, having that as the plan, but then seeing what you're able to land in terms of a potential left or right tackle in free agency or in the draft. La'el Collins was released. He's expected to sign with the Bengals, so he's going to be off the board there, but a great signing for the Bengals in protecting Joe Burrow. Next, you look at the skill position players, right? You're going to have Alvin Kamara. He might not play a full season next year. We'll see what happens with the looming charges that are, that are waiting to be sort of dealt with against him from the alleged Pro Bowl Las Vegas altercation. Then you have Michael Thomas, who is expected to be back in 2022. And then you need to figure out another option there in terms of who it is that you're able to bring in. Now, one of the things that would have made sense with Deshaun Watson would have been going after Will Fuller. They have a chemistry. They're familiar with one another. You're looking for a field stretcher. Will Fuller's kind of got those Kenny Stills hands, so you'd probably be a little bit concerned with that. But when it comes down to it, it gives you an opportunity there to bring in some familiarity. I think in a similar case, when it comes to Jameis Winston showing up in New Orleans or coming back to New Orleans, you already have the familiarity, so you can get a little bit more sort of exotic in terms of your pursuit of wide receivers. So guys like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, for instance, who's according to Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers, his sort of average salary or APY as expected is bouncing between $5 to $10 million per year, but seems more realistic that it'll be between 5 and 7. That's great for New Orleans. It's a great area for them because, again, They can come in low on the first year and then build it up over the course of the next couple of years. If they do, let's say, a 3-year deal like they did with Marcus May, then you can build up to that average as opposed to literally paying out that average. So that would be a receiver that they could go after. Jarvis Landry is still on the market. I think even if the New Orleans Saints haven't been as connected to him as maybe previously reported, I still think he would be a great option for them. If you have Marquez Valdez-Scantling on one side, Michael Thomas on the other side, Jarvis Landry on the inside, and you have 2 versatile pieces, actually 3 versatile pieces there that can all play inside and out, right? They love using Michael Thomas in the slot, for instance. Then great, you put Deontay Hardy on the outside. You put Jarvis Landry on the outside. You have a lot of different things that you can do with those receivers. And then you go to the draft and you look for a Jameson Williams or a Chris Olave or a Garrett Wilson because you didn't make the trade to Houston to get Deshaun Watson. So you still have your first round draft pick and your second round draft pick and potentially both of your third round draft picks, unless you want to use one of those 2 third round draft picks. Because remember, New Orleans was actually gifted a third round compensatory pick as opposed to a 4th and 6th round compensatory pick for what would have been for Trey Hendrickson as well as for Sheldon Rankins. Now that Trey Hendrickson one is actually a 3rd round pick and they didn't get the one for Sheldon Rankins. So you've got 2 third round picks. You can trade one of those for Robert Woods if you feel comfortable and confident about his ACL recovery. Odell Beckham Jr. still a free agent. Reportedly, he was very close to signing with the New Orleans Saints last year before the Rams jumped in. The Rams want to keep him, but they also just signed Allen Robinson. So do you want to go after Odell Beckham Jr. again and try to get him in New Orleans for like the 3rd or 4th time that you've made that attempt? It's certainly a way that they could go. You may not have him available early on in the season, but the early on portion of the season is looking like it might be a little bit of a wash with guys like Marcus May, Alvin Kamara. And then if you bring in Odell Beckham Jr. and other young wide receivers, then you're not really losing anything there if Odell isn't able to go early on in the season. So there's a lot of different ways for the New Orleans Saints to go at wide receiver. And then over on the defensive side, you need to address defensive tackle, which is a market that continues to get flooded now. You also have good defensive tackles and interior defensive linemen when it comes to the NFL draft. You don't have to rush into anything if you're able to make the right signings here. If you're able to use that $30 million instead of sitting around and waiting for somebody, actually going out and signing people. Now, some of these things can also happen in concert with landing Deshaun Watson, particularly the spending part, right? The draft part kind of goes out the window in terms of the early portion of the draft, but there are ways for you to be able to do all this too. You have to bring Deshaun Watson in, restructure his contract, and then you're back to about $20 to $25 million that you can go out and spend that you may already be committed to spending if you've already had some backdoor deals done with anybody that are just waiting for the money to actually be available because right now everything's on hold. So if the Saints don't land Deshaun Watson, if the Saints don't end up with that quarterback, there are still a lot of great options for them over on the offensive side. And even on the defensive side, there are some ways for them to go ahead and continue to build around this team, right? Give this team the defense that it needs in order to win. The defense that Dennis Allen can scheme and can win with. The next piece, though, is what if you lose another big part of the defense? And I'm not even talking about trade here, but Malcolm Jenkins did something really interesting with his contract, and we should break it down a little bit further because it could signal an upcoming retirement announcement. Let's talk about that as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. First, I want to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar, best tasting protein bar on the market, the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar without all the bad things that you have to deal with when it comes to candy bars, like high sugar, high calorie counts, all that stuff. Like, let's look at some of these macros right here. 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, dozens of net carbs when it comes to candy bars, as compared to just 130 calories for a Built Bar, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and you get 17 grams of protein on top of that because these are protein bars, even though they taste like candy bars. And that's one of the things that I love about Built Bars, that they focus on making it taste good first, and then they worry about how to make it healthy. And they've always found a way to do it. Even the Built Bar Puffs follow that same strategy where you're talking about the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. Tastes great, but they still cover it in 100% chocolate, and therefore it still tastes great, but still get you all that protein and none of the sugar. So go check out Built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, so you can get 15% off of your next order. That's 15% off with the promo code LOCKED15 at Built.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a quick look at something curious that happened in the midst of the New Orleans Saints restructuring contracts. Now, one of the things that you usually see from a team that is about ready to make a big move or anything like that is that when they're restructuring contracts, they'll restructure contracts of older veteran players, which ends up pushing money back to far beyond their career, sometimes adding void years, things like that. But something really interesting happened with Malcolm Jenkins' contract. Malcolm Jenkins, of course, finished last season at 34 years old, had the longest active streak after Cam Jordan's came to an end early on in 2021 of 133 straight games. That also came to an end in that weird Monday Night Football COVID-stricken game for the New Orleans Saints and the Miami Dolphins. And so you've seen all of this from Malcolm Jenkins as being this Iron Man throughout his career. But something really, really interesting happened with his contract when it was tended to. It wasn't restructured. It wasn't a situation where they dropped his base salary to vet minimum and then turned it into a signing bonus and therefore are accounting for it over the course of the next couple of years. He simply took pay cuts from where he was to league minimum. And that seems to indicate something there, that maybe it's a procedural move ahead of a larger announcement. And I have been toying around with the idea, and I think many people have, particularly starting last year, that this year, 2021, this most recent season, could have been Malcolm Jenkins' final year, right? Because there were outs in the contract, all these other things. So now to see him shift and take a pay cut that gives him no return, that gives him no restructure, doesn't give him any money up front. He didn't get anything from this. He simply took a pay cut all the way down to $1.12 million this year, $1.65 million next year, $1.6-ish million next year. And so that's really, really close to what Drew Brees did last year ahead of the 2020 season before, of course, announcing his retirement. So could we be seeing the sort of path being laid for a Malcolm Jenkins retirement? We don't know for sure at this moment, but this seems to signal something. And that would be something that makes sense. If that's the case, right? If that happens, not saying that it will, but if it does, what did the New Orleans Saints do next? Well, maybe this explains some of the early interest that was noted when it comes to safety Terron Mathieu, right? Remember, early on in the offseason, there was a lot of conversation about if Malcolm Jenkins signs elsewhere, the Saints could go to Tyrann Mathieu. But what if that wasn't the case? New Orleans Saints and teams or players tend to have these conversations about retirement much earlier in advance. Happened with Patrick Robinson. The team knew well in advance of when he made the announcement. Happened with Max Unger. Team knew well in advance. That's why they were able to sign Nick Easton first before he announced that he was going to be retiring. All of that. So if that was the case, then maybe Terron Mathieu wasn't being looked at by the New Orleans Saints as a replacement for Marcus Williams. Maybe he was being looked at as a replacement for Malcolm Jenkins. And that could potentially mean a safety tandem in 2022 of Marcus May and Terron Mathieu, along with CJ Gardner-Johnson, if he's not a part of a Deshaun Watson trade that may or may not happen. That's a really, really, really good situation. And by the way, I know a lot of folks have said, hey, CJ Gardner-Johnson is probably a part of the trade because you see these things happening on Twitter. Usually players don't know that they're a part of a trade before a trade happens. And honestly, there's 3 steps to this process. The first of which was a qualifying offer for Deshaun Watson, which needed to include a package of 3 first-round picks, additional draft compensation, and young players on low salary cap rookie type contracts. That doesn't mean that anything needed to be specified. In fact, those details, according to folks at NFL Network and others, in most cases haven't even been ironed out yet. The next step of the process, after just the qualifying offer of, yes, we're willing to trade a package of 3 first-round picks and then hit these other qualifications, is the no-trade clause. Then after the no-trade clause is lifted by Deshaun Watson, then the 2 teams need to iron out the rest of the details. So the Saints might not even know if CJ Gardner-Johnson is or isn't a part of the trade package at this time. So when we look at what that Saints secondary could look like, right? If we assume that it's probably one of the offensive linemen in this trade, even if a trade happens with for Deshaun Watson, there's a chance that the New Orleans Saints secondary next year looks like either Marshawn Lattimore, Marcus May, Terron Mathieu, CJ Gardner-Johnson, and Paulson Adebo, or it's Marshawn Lattimore, Marcus May, Tyrann Mathieu, CJ Gardner-Johnson, Bradley Roby, if Paulson Adebo is a part of the trade. Then you can swap out Bradley Roby in place of CJ Gardner-Johnson and keep Paulson Adebo out on the outside if CJ Gardner-Johnson is indeed a part of the trade. But if it's an offensive lineman, this is a really, really fantastic secondary for New Orleans to be able to move into in 2022 if they lose Malcolm Jenkins and Marcus Williams, who they've already lost, who has signed his contract with Baltimore, but they've replaced him with Marcus May. So what looked like it could be this absolute detriment, right? The New Orleans Saints losing Marcus Williams, compounded then with the potential of losing Malcolm Jenkins. The New Orleans Saints could actually come out of this with a very good secondary still, and maybe not see much drop-off with Dennis Allen's coaching and Dennis Allen's scheme. It's a really interesting situation. Now we'll watch and see what happens when it comes to Malcolm Jenkins and the way that that contract was cut, right? It was a pay cut entirely. And what that means for him in the future, we don't know. We'll see. But to think that the New Orleans Saints could end up losing Marcus Williams and Malcolm Jenkins and still have a very strong secondary in 2022, 2 months ago, would have been unprecedented conversation. Right now, it looks very much like it could be a reality. All right, family. So we're going into the weekend here. If any big news happens, you know that I'll be here with another episode for you. But otherwise, I will see you on Monday. We've got Mock Draft Monday on the way. We're able to kind of do a mid-free agency mock draft based upon what the New Orleans Saints have or have not done or what they were waiting around to do. We'll see exactly what happens there. And then, of course, we'll keep you up to date with everything around the New Orleans Saints in terms of any potential free agent moves. And if the New Orleans Saints don't land Deshaun Watson, what's next for them? If they do, what's next for them? We'll break down every angle that we can of all of this. But as of right now, it's a holding pattern. And if it's one the New Orleans Saints want to be a part of, then it's one that they'll be a part of. So thank you, as always, for being a part of our show here over at Locked On Saints and making us your first listen of the day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, especially with Mock Draft Monday on the way. Eric Crocker, Ryan Tracy just put out his draft guide, whole bunch of good stuff on the way over there. So don't miss it wherever you get your podcasts and, of course, on YouTube as well. As always, for everything you need in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.